It was transgender all along. Boo-doo-boo, boo-doo-boo, boo-doo-boo. Sorry, I've got that stuck in your head. Hello, interwebs. I hope you're all doing well. And for today's video, I kind of want to build on a conversation that I've been having in a few recent videos of mine on this channel and even over on my main channel, as well as address some criticism that I was getting that's come in a couple different flavors on my recent review of the most recent episode of the Marvel show Agatha All Along, where I discussed a character in that show, Billy Kaplan, who I read as a transgender metaphor, which may or may not even have been intended by the show, though the show being very queer, it might possibly be the case. But we don't know for sure. And some of the criticism that I got out of that video was kind of twofold. One, why does everything have to be read as a transgender metaphor? I mean, the character is very clearly not explicitly trans, is not intended to be trans, and even going further, the character is a gay character. They make that very explicit within the same episode. And some people even saying, like, me reading that as a trans metaphor and seeing him as, a character who might be read as a trans femme metaphor is taking away from the explicit gayness of, and me sort of like maybe even taking away from the power of that, because it is powerful to a lot of people that there is, explicit gayness, queerness within Marvel, which has always been very reticent to showcase that because Disney sucks. And so, me reading the character as a trans femme character, if she were to come out as a woman within the show, that would take away from the gay representation. And I certainly understand that. And I kind of wanted to address that criticism because I think it underscores kind of a interesting thing when we talk about transgender metaphor and what I see transgender metaphor as, and why I apply a transgender sort of reading to characters, even when they are not intended to be explicitly trans. Why I think that there is value in that as a type of critical analytical lens, as well as just queerness as an analytical lens on movies and TV shows and art as a line of critique, even when the show or movie isn't intended to be explicitly queer or trans at all, even when there's not even an intention of that. And this I kind of want to build off of the other video that I recently did, which was talking about the movie I Saw the TV Glow, where that movie is very clearly a intentional transgender metaphor, and I would say also a very clearly explicitly transgender main character in the movie, but the movie does not go out of its way to be very overtly explicit. Yeah, I watched that video because I won't rehash all of it, but like the long and short of it is like, yeah, the movie does not be very clear in saying like, this is transgender, like very much like beating you over the head in metaphor of what it is, but it never takes a moment to have the characters be like, I am transgender. And that kind of being part of the power of the film, that the film is powerful because if it was explicitly transgender, there would be some people based on our cultural perception right now of transgender people being very vilified and ostracized, and also very segmented off as like a separate, like, oh, this is a transgender feeling, like I can never relate to that, but I certainly, even people who are sympathetic to transgender people, is like, I'm sympathetic, but like that's I understand that being trans and not relating and so by not being explicitly transgender allows people to kind of jump into that feeling a little bit more and understand the relatability of being transgender a lot more. You can't deny the transgender aspects of that film. Like, no one, if anyone went out and said like, this isn't a trans film, like someone would say about maybe The Matrix as a movie, which we'll get back to, which is also very clearly a trans metaphor, but you see right-wing people be like, oh, The Matrix is not trans. How dare you read it as a transgender metaphor? It's about being a strong man, being the one. People deny that, whereas in I Saw the TV Glow, you can't really deny that. However, it kind of does something similar to The Matrix in that people can read into the same feelings that underlie that transgender metaphor, and it enabling people to understand that the feelings being transgender are just human feelings, just expressed in a specific way through gender, because our society genders people, and gender is a sort of line of how our current Western society specifically that I live within, and many of you I'm assuming live within as well, sort of like tries to segment and delineate and sort of in many ways sort of dictate to people how they should live their lives within the boundaries of our societal expectations, and sort of set people on a specific path, and how gender for trans people is a way that we sort of express our desire to break out of that societal expectation. Which kind of brings me back to the character of, and I want to kind of talk about Agatha All Along specifically, but then sort of broaden it out to talk about why I think it's useful to apply a transgender lens. Because when we look at the character of Billy within the show, and if you have not seen the show, I'll try and keep it very surface level and so you can kind of understand what I'm saying. But as I said before, the character is explicitly gay, but in the show there are elements of his narrative that I read as it is a transgender metaphor. I mean, part of the story is, he's a Jewish character, and we see his character in this episode at his bar mitzvah, this sort of ceremony for Jewish men who, like, this is the day you become a man. And so it's this very manhood-centric ceremony, and on that same day, he dies, and he's told first that he has 2 lives living in him, and then he dies and then is inhabited by the body of another dead character from another show, WandaVision, because MCU, it's all connected. After that point, his parents are sort of wondering about him. He can read minds because, again, Marvel, and he sort of, like, is worried about, like, how his parents perceive him, and thinking about, like reading their minds, and, like, they're worried about him. But then also within the show, and this kind of gets at the other criticism that I was sort of leveled at me, which I think is also fair, where he sort of desires to become a witch, and sort of looks up to Agatha, the main character of the show, as a sort of queer elder, and kind of throughout the show showcases a desire to become a witch, which I mentioned in my review was very feminine coded. We'll get back to that as well, because the criticism that I got was witches are not inherently women. Like, witch can be multifaceted, gendered thing, both within our real world and even arguably within the world of Marvel. But before we jump into that, talking about those elements, you can clearly see that there's a relationship to transness and just queerness generally. The witch stuff, I think, is sort of what ties it even more to transness in my mind. But those sort of feelings that I just expressed very much dovetail with a queer and a transgender reading. And again, I don't know if this character was intended to be a transgender metaphor, very clearly intended to be gay coded, but I don't know if it was intended to be trans. And I understand people being like, why are you applying a transgender reading to a character that may or may not have been intended to be trans, but it was very clearly intended to be gay? And my thing is, when we apply readings to works of art, critical lenses to works of art, it is not me or anyone saying this is the interpretation of the film, or this is the interpretation of the work that is even intended or is the only one, but it is one to say, this lens is useful to look at this through to maybe pull out some interesting themes, ideas, and, criticisms of the work. And I think that is generally pretty useful to apply to any work of art. I mean, let me just make another example. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, because I'm a huge nerd. I love looking at Deep Space Nine as a Star Trek show through a queer analytical lens. The show is not necessarily intended to be queer, but if you look at Deep Space Nine, just the ethos of the show, it is about characters who are not on the flagship of the fleet, not on the USS Enterprise. They are shoved off to the side of the Federation. They're always kind of like the rejects, or the people who are sort of like didn't want to be in Starfleet, like Cisco, or just people who are working class people like O'Brien. You have your your gay, bisexual, or whatever Cardassian fascist lizard people. Complicated show. But so they're the people that aren't the, like, people who are seen as, the top of the top, the flagship officers like Picard or Kirk or whatever. But yet they still live within this society on the outskirts of it, and sometimes live up to its ideals and sometimes don't, but ultimately like try to hold on to their relationship to the society, and sometimes balk against that, and sometimes critique the Federation or Starfleet or other societies, and sometimes wish to live up to those ideals, and sometimes even live up to those ideals better than the Federation or Starfleet as institutions themselves do. And I think, while the show was not overtly intended to be like, hey, this is a gay-coded show, looking at that show through a queer lens, I think provides a very interesting analysis of that series. And you could even go even more specific with like characters like Dax in that show, who is for those of you who don't know, is an alien who has a slug within her that gives her memories of past lives. And many people, myself included, read that character as a transgender metaphor of like the host before her, we meet her in the show, was a man. And a lot of characters knew her as that male characters, and sometimes even refer to her affectionately as like old man within the show, or remember her old name and then switch to her new name like the Klingons do.
Oh, Kazan, my beloved old friend.
I'm Jadzia now.
Well, Jadzia, my beloved old friend.
And a lot of trans people have read that as a very affirming transgender metaphor in a lot of ways, of people accepting her transition. But the show, I don't think, intended that explicitly, but it's one that we can read that transgender metaphor on and draw a lot out of. And just sci-fi in general, people view themselves in characters like aliens, like Spock, as an othered style character and apply different lenses to them, even if they're not intended. Like, Data, for example, is often read as an autistic metaphor or read through an autistic lens, even though, again, Data necessarily wouldn't be explicitly autistic or intended to be autistic within the show. And there's problems with doing that too, because you get some things about like people saying, oh, him getting more emotions makes him more human, which is often a way to dehumanize autistic people. Oh, autistic people don't have the same emotions or feel the same emotions as people. This is not me saying that. And so they feel less human, even though autistic people feel very much emotions. We just express it differently. And that's a way that we are dehumanized. And so for the show Star Trek to say like Data needed to get an emotion chip to become more human could be read as a very offensive reading under an autistic lens, which I think is interesting. It's not necessarily condemning the show, because the show didn't even intend that necessarily, but it's one that's like, oh, this is an interesting lens to read this through and sort of like come to an understanding for it, especially because it is a show that is science fiction and is meant to be allegorical in many ways. Like the show may be talking about androids like Data in a very literal sense, but Data's not supposed to represent just androids. He's supposed to represent some part of humanity in all of us. And I think these lenses are really interesting to discuss these things through, and such is the same with transness. When I look at a character like Billy in Agatha All Along and I say I see a transgender metaphor here, I think that is a useful lens that is, I think, provides a unique way to look at the work. And I am a transgender filmmaker. I am a transgender critic. And so when you come to my videos, that's kind of the lens. I'm not going to put it on every single thing, but I'm always going to be looking at something through that perspective and going to be explaining my view on something from that perspective as a trans person, as well as just someone who sometimes applies a transgender lens to look at work. Now I'll apply other lenses on works as well to critique them through or look at them through or analyze them through. But the trans one is going to be probably one of the most accessible ones for me, alongside being autistic and alongside being a woman generally. So those are just the lenses that I'm going to look at a work through. Now, one of the problems that this discussion often brings up is kind of ones that I alluded to earlier, which is they're often placed at odds with each other. One of the examples that I just gave earlier, which is, Billy is an explicitly gay character within the show. And so me putting on a trans femme lens, I think some people took as me being antagonistic to people who, saw a gay character and really appreciated that. In fact, there was a really wonderful comment on the video who argued on my review, who argued that they didn't like me having a trans reading of the character because, they saw Billy as a very feminine gay man, and they were very femme, and they found affirmation in that identity and affirmation in seeing a character represent a very femme gay character, and me reading them as trans femme and saying like, it kind of felt to them as me saying like, oh, because this character had a more femme presentation, they should be a woman. Which is not what I was saying, but I understand why that would be the case of like, don't take this thing away from me because this is meaningful to me. And I think it's because we live in a society, but we live in a society that tends to say like, well, one thing has to slot in one bucket or the other. It has to be this thing or that thing. It has to be this, it has to be a guy or a girl, it has to be trans or gay, it has to be da-da-da-da-da. But I don't see these things as antagonistic to each other, especially when we're talking about fictional characters. If I was doing that to a real life person, like I see people doing this to like someone like Kurt Cobain in real life, but I think is kind of messed up. If I was doing that to a real person and saying like, well, Kurt Cobain should have just been a woman, a trans woman, I think that is putting labels onto somebody, especially if the person's living. And we see this with like the queer, like people accusing real life people of queer baiting. I think that's kind of messed up. But when we're talking about fictional characters, they are not real people. They are works of art made to be interpreted. And so these readings of works should not necessarily be antagonistic to each other, but it should be opening up this conversation about how these feelings that we feel as maybe a feminine gay man or a trans woman are not so antagonistic to each other, but overlap in really interesting ways based on the society that we live in, our own internal feelings, and then how we wish to express ourselves as people and perform our existence as people, talking some Judith Butler stuff, in different ways, and how that's valuable and beautiful and yet ultimately connects us in a really wonderful way. And that was just talking within the queer community, but you can see this happening a lot, especially when we're talking about like more people aligning with like hegemonic societal norms. I mean, recently, I talked about this in a video over my main channel. There was this thing that happened to me where I made a joke about Frodo and Sam from Lord of the Rings being read as gay, which is something that like so many people have done since the movies came out, even before the movies came out. Like there was a lot of people that read those characters as gay because of their very affectionate relationship with each other within the movies, the books, what have you. And I think that that's a very valuable lens. I kind of said it as a joke on Twitter, but I think that's a very valuable lens to read those characters through. And I got harassed by fans of one giant YouTuber named Critical Drinker, who essentially argued that, you know, I was trying to shove my gay shit into a very loving, straight relationship. And you see this often come up when people read gay, like either ship gay characters within a show or like read gayness into a character that isn't explicitly gay in a show. You'll often see people get very angry and say, you know, why can't it just be a very healthy, platonic relationship between two men? Why do you have to make it always gay? And kind of placing like a platonic straight relationship as antagonistic to a gay one. And I'm sitting here being like, why do those two things need to be antagonistic to each other? Why can't they coexist in the spectrum of human feeling and human emotion? And some people may express, you know, that type of relationship in a platonic way. Some people may read it in a gay way, but those emotions at the base of what these characters are feeling are the same in many ways. And I think that unites us as humans. But it can be used as a way to uphold hegemonic power structures. So when someone like the Critical Drinker, who is doing it in, let's just say in a bad faith way, to be nice, is setting those two things against each other to say that these things cannot coexist and that gayness needs to be shoved out of their franchises that they love. And that wokeness and groomers and whatever are coming into their media. Or like he even does it for women. Like women shouldn't be strong. They should, they're trying to make men look weak by having strong female characters. And it's kind of placing these two things as antagonistic to each other to reinforce the roles that we are shoved into and how society wants us to exist in certain shapes or forms as very separate buckets of men being opposite women, gay being versus straight, cis versus trans. Whereas art, I think the power of art is when we talk about something very specific, tell a very specific story, but understand the emotions behind that character's very specific story, we can see the universality of human emotions. We can see ourselves in a character that is not necessarily our experience, and yet we can relate to them. And we are often, as me as a marginalized person, told to do that through straight cis hetero characters. We have so many straight cis hetero character protagonists of movies and TV shows, and I read myself in a bunch of them. I see myself in characters like Superman or, Picard or Riker. Like take your pick of whatever main character of most TV shows and movies. I see myself in those characters, but, our society has not taught many people to feel that same empathy in return towards marginalized people. And so when you have characters leading franchises or leading movies or TV shows that are not cis straight white dudes, people will reject violently, sometimes in the case of Critical Drinker or others, having to empathize and having to see themselves in these characters and get very angry about the fact that they have to, because they have been explicitly told that they should not see themselves in the other, that they should see that as a separate thing. And that is ultimately a tool used to promote, dominant power structures. I've gotten way off the beat of Agatha all along, but I think this is all kind of tying together in how we talk about and interpret art. And the last element of this that I do kind of want to touch upon, because I sort of alluded to it earlier, and I think it's an interesting criticism that kind of is separate, and I'll kind of make it quick, but I do want to talk about it, and it kind of touches upon some of these elements, is the other element of the Agatha all along thing, which is, some people said, because I said in the review, I read transness in Billy even more so because he aligns himself with being a witch, and witches in the show are coded as a feminine thing. And I think that this is, and I think there was an understandable reaction against me there, because in real life, there are people who align with being a witch. I have many Wiccan friends. There is a stigma of like being a witch is seen as just a girl thing, when that's not actually true within real life. And it's often coded within media that way. Now, The reason that I bring that up, though, within Marvel is because Marvel has been doing it, especially within Egg It All Along, has been dealing with witchcraft in an interesting way. If we want to get very nerdy about it, the show and Marvel generally has made a delineation between warlock and witchcraft. Warlock you see in like Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange himself is a warlock, but obviously that's not just for men, as we see, with the Sorcerer Supreme Tilda Swinton's character in those movies, a woman very much a warlock, and witchcraft, which I think there might be some male. I don't know if we've ever seen a male witch within the MCU. I mean, I guess unless you're counting Billy. There you go. But even before Billy, like that, it was for most part very women coded, or had a lot of women characters. And even the show Agatha has talked about witchcraft as a very feminine coded thing, which is like there's an episode even in Agatha All Along where they ride brooms, and a character sort of complain about riding brooms because it's seen as a form of aligning ourselves with domesticity. So witches don't like to use brooms, which again, brooms as a sign of domesticity are sort of related to how our society sees womanhood as women being domestic and having to stay in the home. So there's clearly an aligning between witchcraft and how womanhood is seen. However, that scene also makes very clear that those sort of expectations placed onto witchcraft, aka how it's sort of like a metaphorical womanhood within the show, is only an expectation. Is only an expectation placed onto it. So when I say something like, this feminine coded thing that he wants to be aligned with, that is me kind of talking about how the society in Marvel has aligned witchcraft with womanhood, both the show itself and then also like the in-universe show, like the Marvel universe itself. And so for him to want to align himself with a woman coded thing could be read as like a feminine gay man who finds, power in, things aligning with womanhood. Like that happens within the gay community quite often. For example, like, gay men often loving female pop stars is sort of like a stereotypical example of that. But also sort of discussing, but also within the trans community, trans women sort of like, I want to be a witch. I see myself as a witch instead of a warlock, like that sort of element of it. But it also speaks to, because it is not the witches are definitively women within the show, it kind of goes back to that same idea, which is why I think Agatha All Along is very smart about this, talking about how these things are associated with womanhood, but do not necessarily have to align with womanhood. But I also understand people balking at a reading like that because of the stigma around being a witch within the real world and how it has also been very much gendered as well. And it's something that I maybe if you're serious, been watching the video instead of listening to me talk, it's this book I've had in the background here. This is something that Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my favorite fantasy writers of all time and science fiction writers of all time, sort of dealt with in this book, Tahanu, which is her fourth book in her Wizards of Earthsea series. If you read the Wizards of Earthsea series, it's one of my favorite series of all time. Like, please read them all. I read a lot of trans metaphor in that series as well. But quick download on what that book is about. It's the fourth book in the series. She wrote it decades after she wrote the first three. In the first three books, she made a wizarding school in it, and only boys went to that wizarding school. And years later, after she had gone through a lot more, she lived through a lot more feminist movements between those books and when she wrote this next one, Ursula Le Guin started thinking about that and being like, that's a problem. And I don't know why I did that, other than just the fact that I had a lot of internalized, potentially misogyny that I was, not really breaking down when I was writing the book. And so she wrote Tahanu to not sort of say like, all of that stuff was wrong, but to actually break down her own biases. And in this book, essentially, we meet a character from the previous books, a woman character, who does do witchcraft, and it is seen as different within the society from men's magic, the magic that you get to study at school. Women's magic is seen as more domestic, wilder, looked down upon within the society. But the book goes out of its way to sort of discuss how these forms of magic are not antithetical to each other, nor are they even really that different. It's just how men and women have been taught and delineated to how they think about magic. And that the type of magic they're accessing may be different, but it is different based on societal expectation and different based on how they are taught and how they are affirmed in their use of magic. Not necessarily something that is inherently biological about magic being a male or women-coded thing. And yet still there is power in viewing magic through those lenses for people who have been marginalized. And I think that's a really interesting discussion that she brings up within that book. And I think it's something that, like, Agatha All Along certainly not is hitting the highs of what Ursula K. Le Guin's doing. She's on another level. She's one of the best science fiction fantasy writers of all time. But I think Agatha All Along is kind of hitting upon some of those similar beats and notes within its kind of discussions of magic and gender and queerness in, I think, a very interesting way that I found to be kind of fascinating, that is opening up this discussion. Anyways, I think that's everything that I kind of want to say. I'm sure I missed something or screwed something up, but I just wanted to open up this discussion. This was all free-formed off the top of my head, so I'm sure I've misspoken in some shape or form, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. But I kind of wanted to just address those criticisms, because I think they were fair criticisms, and I understand where they were coming from, but I think it ties into a much bigger discussion that I think is fascinating in how we talk about fiction and metaphor and, applying queer and trans lenses to works of art, as well as any lens onto a work of art that comes from especially a marginalized or stigmatized and less understood community, because they will always sort of be seen as antagonistic to especially hegemonic views, but even against other marginalized groups. And I think that is detrimental sometimes to our ability to talk about art and the strength and power and breadth of art, but also, I think is something that we should be doing more of to try and cross these boundaries of what it means to be human and break past these labels and delineations our society's put on us. Anyways, I'm just kind of rambling and repeating myself now. So I love y'all. Take care of yourselves, and I hope y'all live long and prosper.